Good evening. You're looking live at Launch Complex 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, where SpaceX is counting down to the launch of a Falcon 9 rocket with the last batch of the version 1.5 Starlink satellites. And we're now less than an hour to launch of the Falcon 9. Liftoff is scheduled for 12:40 a.m. Eastern Time. That's 4:40 UTC for our viewers around the world. Should there be a weather or technical problem, there is a backup launch opportunity tomorrow night, Saturday morning, at 12:15 a.m. Eastern Time or 4:15 UTC. For the second time this week, SpaceX will push the envelope by flying a Falcon 9 rocket for a 16th time. It was just on Sunday that booster 1058 flew for that record-breaking mission. Tonight, it is the turn of booster tail number 1060 to launch on its 16th mission. Previously, SpaceX had certified its fleet of boosters for up to 15 flights. It's now pushing the envelope and probably is heading towards a maximum of 20 flights for each booster. I'm Stephen Young, and I'll be providing commentary from Spaceflight Now's News Bureau at the Kennedy Space Center press site. I'm joined by my colleagues Adam Bernstein and Will Robinson-Smith. If you'd like to go ahead and support our coverage of the space program, please hit the thumbs up button to like this stream. That really helps us bring in a wider audience to our coverage. And if you haven't already, click the subscribe button so you'll get notifications of our future coverage. You can also support our team's work by using the Super Chat feature or by becoming a member of our YouTube channel. We can't do these broadcasts without the support of our members and viewers, and we'd like to thank everyone who's made a contribution and helped fund our coverage. We're now at T-minus 57 minutes and counting. We're about 20 minutes away from the point when the launch director will hopefully give a go for the start of propellant load for this morning's launch. SpaceX is running its countdown from the Launch and Landing Control Center just outside the south gate of Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. The launch team is also supported by control rooms at SpaceX's headquarters in Hawthorne, California. By this point, the chief engineer should have already conducted their technical poll. The weather looks good tonight. We've had some stormy weather on the Space Coast. The 45th Weather Squadron issued a forecast earlier today that predicted an 85% chance of acceptable conditions for launch. We're also not expecting any problems with upper-level winds or with the weather in the booster recovery area in the Atlantic Ocean.
Ground station's off for 5.
Let's take a closer look at the Falcon 9 vehicle. It stands 70 meters or 229 feet tall and has a diameter of 3.6 meters or 12 feet. The bottom 2/3 of the rocket is the first stage, in this case booster 1060 in the SpaceX fleet, making its 16th flight tonight. At the base of the first stage are the 9 Merlin engines, which burn rocket-grade kerosene and liquid oxygen. Together they produce 1.7 million pounds of thrust. Around the engine compartment are the black carbon fiber landing legs that will be used to land on the drone ship, about 8.5 minutes into the flight. Above the first stage is the interstage. This is a composite structure consisting of an aluminum honeycomb core surrounded by carbon fiber. In the inset image, you can see the deployable hypersonic grid fins. These are titanium winglets that provide stability and steering for the Falcon 9 as it falls through the atmosphere during its entry as it heads towards the landing on the drone ship. At the top of the interstage are 3 mechanical latches that attach to the second stage. At first stage main engine cutoff, high pressure helium is used to release those latches, and 4 pneumatic pushes ensure there is a clean separation between the stages. The second stage nozzle is safely housed inside the interstage adapter until stage separation. The upper stage is powered by a single modified Merlin engine called a Merlin vacuum engine, or MVAC. It's equipped with a large nozzle optimized for burns in the vacuum of space. It produces more than 200,000 pounds of thrust. It will be fired twice on today's flight to place the 54 Starlink satellites into their intended orbit. At the very top of the rocket is the payload fairing, containing the 54 Starlink satellites. The payload fairing is made of a carbon composite material and is 13 meters or 43 feet tall and 5.2 meters or 17 feet in diameter. 2 halves of the fairing will be recovered downrange from where the first stage will land on the drone ship. They will gently splash down under parachutes and will be picked up by a SpaceX recovery ship and returned to Cape Canaveral for refurbishment.
Ground station's back on comm.
We are hearing audio from SpaceX's launch control. That's coming to us via SpaceX. There is a slight delay in the stream we receive, so the calls are not quite in real time, but within a few seconds. Let's take a look at the countdown timeline for today's Starlink mission. At T-minus 38 minutes, we should hear the results of the go, no-go poll from the launch director. If the go is given, propellant load will start at T-minus 35 minutes. At that point, liquid oxygen will be loaded aboard the first stage of the rocket, and kerosene fuel will be loaded onto both the first and second stages. At about T-minus 20 minutes, we'll see the so-called big vent. This is a purge of the Strongback plumbing that is used to fill the second stage with liquid oxygen. It's quite a prominent vent that can look quite spectacular depending on the wind conditions. Then at T-minus 16 minutes, that vent will conclude and the loading of liquid oxygen aboard the second stage will begin. At T-minus 7 minutes, the chill down of the 9 Merlin engines will get underway. This involves flowing a small amount of liquid oxygen through the plumbing and the turbo pumps. This will protect the engines from the risk of thermal shock and damage during the startup sequence. About 6 minutes prior to launch, the first stage kerosene tank should be full, and then at T-minus 4.5 minutes, we'll see the Strongback, the structure that sits alongside the vehicle on the pad, retract away from the rocket. It'll recline to an angle of about 1.5 degrees, and then at liftoff it will swing back further. At about 2 minutes, liquid oxygen loading should be complete. There will be about 1 million pounds of propellant aboard the vehicle by that point. And then in the final 60 seconds of the countdown, control will be handed over to the onboard computers from the ground sequencer. The propellant tanks will be brought up to flight pressure. The SpaceX launch director will give their go for liftoff. And then the engine ignition command will be issued at T-minus 3 seconds. If all 9 engines ignite and are healthy, the flight computer will give the command to release the hold down clamps, and the Falcon 9 will rise from the launch pad. This morning's launch is taking place from Space Launch Complex 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. This pad was originally constructed in the 1960s for the U.S. Air Force's Titan rocket program. SpaceX took over the launch pad on the retirement of the Titan IV rocket in 2007. And it flew a Falcon 9 from Pad 40 for the first time in June 2010. Work is now underway at Pad 40 to build an access tower for SpaceX's Dragon spacecraft, so cargo and crew missions to the space station can be launched from there. Currently, only Launch Pad 39A is equipped for those Dragon missions. Once again, if you're just joining us and haven't done so already, please hit the like button. That really helps us bring our coverage to a wider audience. And if you subscribe to our channel, you'll always be notified of when we are going live with coverage of a launch. Now less than 40 minutes to the launch of the Falcon 9. We should soon be hearing from the launch director on the results of the poll.
Attention launch operators, this is the launch director on the countdown net with abort instructions. For non-urgent no-go conditions, brief the CE or LD and they will approve aborting the countdown. For urgent issues affecting the safety of the operation, operators shall call hold on the primary countdown net. Launch control will abort the launch auto sequence immediately and proceed into the launch abort auto sequence. At T-minus 10 seconds, launch control will be hands-off and relying on automated abort criteria for the remainder of the count.
Tanks are venting for the start of propellant load.
And it appears SpaceX is proceeding with the loading of propellants aboard the Falcon 9. That call we just heard indicates that the first steps of that process are underway. The start of propellant load is scheduled to get underway at T-minus 35 minutes. That operation is being overseen by the launch team in the SpaceX Launch and Landing Control Center. That facility is about 10 miles south of the launch pad near Cape Canaveral.
The launch auto sequence has started.
And there we have confirmation from the SpaceX launch team that the loading of propellants is now underway. Kerosene is being loaded aboard the first stage and second stages, and densified superchilled liquid oxygen will be loaded in this first stage of the propellant loading process aboard the first stage. Very soon we might see the first signs of vapors forming around the first stage of the booster. This is caused by the humid Florida air coming into contact with the structure of the rocket, which is being filled with this super cold propellant, and the humid air condenses and creates a fog and swirl of vapors around the outside of the booster, and you'll also see a line of frost creeping up as the tank fills with propellants. So once again, this is booster 1060. It is making its 16th flight. It's only the second booster to reach that milestone, and the first booster to fly for the 16th time was booster 1058, which actually flew only 4 days ago on Sunday night. So that's 2 SpaceX Falcon 9s pushing the envelope and breaking through the previously set barrier of 15 reuses of the Falcon 9 first stage. This Falcon 9 booster first flew in June 2020, launching a Global Positioning System satellite for the US Air Force, which became the Space Force later. It then went on to launch 60 Starlink satellites on a mission in September 2020. Another 60 satellites for Starlink followed in October of that year. It then launched the Turksat 5A communication satellite in January 2021. Another 60 Starlink satellites were lofted in February of that year. And it followed that with another 2 Starlink missions. Those all carried 60 of the version 1 Starlink satellites. It then made a transporter mission. This is SpaceX's rideshare program, which they launch multiple satellites for various entities on the same vehicle. It was back to launching Starlinks, 48 satellites in December 2021, followed by another 49 in January and 47 in March and 53 in April and June. In October 2022, it was back to launching communication satellites with the Galaxy 33 and 34 satellites for Intelsat. It returned to transporter duties in January of this year. And that was its last launch. That was 192 days ago. Since then, we believe it has undergone refurbishment and inspections to clear it for this 16th mission. As you can see from this video of the launch pad, those vapors have started to appear, indicating the liquid oxygen is flowing into the first stage tank on the Falcon 9 booster. Kerosene is also being loaded aboard the first stage and the second stage. This mission is designated Starlink 5-15. It is the 93rd SpaceX launch, primarily dedicated to the deployment of the Starlink satellite constellation. This file photo shows what the satellites look like stacked in their launch configuration. They are flat packed together. You can see in the background one half of the payload fairing. This photo was taken on a previous mission before the satellites were encapsulated within that fairing. These 54 satellites will join the Starlink network, providing low latency and high-speed internet service to SpaceX's customers. The satellites are known as Starlink version 1.5. They're the last of these versions of the Starlink satellites. Each of them weighs about 660 pounds and is powered by solar panels and uses ion propulsion to raise their orbits. They were constructed at a SpaceX facility in Redmond, Washington. Here's a view of the Starlink dish that consumers can purchase and mount on their home. There are also dishes available for vehicles and boats. The Starlink version 1.5 satellites are being replaced by the version 2 mini satellites. SpaceX started launching these new improved satellites earlier this year. They are much larger, and as you might be able to tell, there are fewer of them stacked on top of each other aboard Falcon 9s carrying the new spacecraft. T-minus 23 minutes and counting. SpaceX uses a densified liquid oxygen. That's where the liquid oxygen is super chilled, much colder than liquid oxygen used by many other rockets. By densifying the oxygen in this way, SpaceX can pack in more propellants and gain more performance out of the vehicle. Earlier versions of the Falcon 9 rocket did not use this densified propellant, and it was introduced to boost the rocket's payload capacity. It also meant that the fueling process was condensed into the final 35 minutes of the countdown, and it doesn't permit SpaceX to hold the countdown clock should they have a problem, because the propellants are loaded at the last minute. It's called load and go, and the propellants would warm up if the countdown was held and would no longer be in the super cold condition that they're needed to be in for the rocket to function. In the last 10 minutes, helium should also have been loaded aboard the Falcon 9. That helium is used to pressurize the propellant tanks during flight. We're coming up on the big vent from the Strongback. You can just see that starting now.
Stage 2 RP1 load is complete.
And we just heard the call from SpaceX that the loading of kerosene, the highly refined rocket-grade kerosene known as RP1, has been completed on the second stage. The loading of kerosene and liquid oxygen on the first stage continues. You can really see the that vent wrapping itself around the vehicle. There's very little wind tonight, so it's spilling out of that vent on the Strongback and just sitting alongside the vehicle there. This purging of the Strongback is in preparation for the loading of liquid oxygen aboard the second stage of the Falcon 9. It ensures all that plumbing in the Strongback is chilled down and ready for the start of the flow of liquid oxygen. Just a reminder, if you haven't done so already, please hit the thumbs up or like button. That really helps us out. The so-called big vent is continuing at the launch pad. Vapors condensing in the humid Florida air coming from the Strongback structure that sits up against the side of the rocket. That provides structural support and the plumbing for the second stage of the rocket. It also provides air conditioning for the payloads and other power and communications lines. That vent is now coming to an end, and we'll soon be hearing the call that the start of propellant load in the second stage, the liquid oxygen load, is underway.
Stage 2 LOX load has started.
Confirmation from SpaceX that loading of liquid oxygen on the second stage is now underway. Earlier in the count, the loading of kerosene, RP1 fuel was completed on the second stage. Loading of liquid oxygen now underway on both the first and second stage, and kerosene is still being loaded aboard the first stage of the vehicle. Let's take a look at the mission statistics. This is the 16th launch of Falcon 9 booster 1060, joining the other booster in SpaceX's fleet, 1058. At that particular milestone of 16 flights, 1058 made that mission this past Sunday. And it has been the first time that SpaceX has cleared boosters to fly beyond the previously certified limit of 15 flights. This will be the 239th launch of a Falcon 9 rocket since 2010, when the first launch took place. It's also the 199th SpaceX launch from Florida's Space Coast, from the Cape Canaveral Space Force Station and Kennedy Space Center. SpaceX operates two pads here, Pad 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station and Pad 39A at the Kennedy Space Center. This will be the 124th SpaceX launch from Pad 40 and the 188th launch overall from that pad. Previously, the pad saw launches of the Air Force's Titan rocket. This is also the 47th SpaceX orbital launch so far this year. The Falcon 9 will be heading southeast out of the Cape Canaveral Space Force Station this morning. It will be heading towards an orbit of 43 degrees inclined to the equator. The first stage booster will land on the drone ship, a shortfall of Gravitas, which is stationed in the Atlantic Ocean, just east of the Bahamas. It's about 400 miles downrange from the Cape. SpaceX has 3 converted ocean barges that it uses for these SpaceX Falcon 9 landings and recoveries. The shortfall of Gravitas is the most recent addition to the SpaceX fleet. Joined the recovery vessels in 2021. The Falcon 9 is targeting an orbit with a low point of 186 miles, the perigee, or 299 kilometers, and a high point or apogee of 211 miles, or 339 kilometers. And once again, that's at an inclination of 43 degrees to the equator. And you can see now as the loading of liquid oxygen aboard the first and second stages is taking place, the vapors that form around the vehicle are stretching up the entire length of the first stage, and you can start to see that forming also on the second stage of the vehicle. We're at T-minus 9 minutes. Let's take a quick look at the events you can expect to see after liftoff. Just over a minute into flight, the vehicle will cross through the point of maximum aerodynamic pressure, known as max Q. That's when the vehicle's forward velocity and air pressure create the maximum stress on the vehicle. The first stage will fire for 2 minutes and 26 seconds before the 9 Merlin engines are cut off and the separation of the stages occurs. We'll then see ignition of the second stage, followed soon after by the payload fairing jettison. While the second stage soars towards orbit, the first stage will continue to arc downrange, continuing to climb for a while before starting to plunge back towards Earth. And to prevent any damage to the vehicle, the entry burn takes place about 6 minutes into flight to slow the vehicle so that the friction with the atmosphere does not overheat the structure. The vehicle will then full using cold gas thrusters and the titanium grid fins for steering. The first stage landing burn occurs about 8 minutes into the flight, followed by the landing about 20 seconds later. Meanwhile, the second stage will cut off its engine for the first time. It will then coast.
Engine chill has started.
And we just heard there that the engine chill sequence is underway. The second stage will then reignite for just a few seconds, 54 minutes into flight, and the Starlink satellites will be deployed into their orbit an hour and 5 minutes and 52 seconds into flight. That engine chill that we just heard the call for is a process that allows a little bit of liquid oxygen to flow into the engine system to cool down the plumbing and the turbo pumps, so that when the actual engine ignition sequence begins, there is not a shock to the system.
Stage 1 RP1 load is complete.
And just had confirmation from SpaceX that the loading of kerosene aboard the first stage is now complete. So liquid oxygen continues to be loaded aboard both stages at this time. But the kerosene load is now complete on both first and second stages. T-minus 5 minutes and counting. Everything looking good so far for a launch at 12:40 a.m. Eastern Time tonight. The next step will be
Strongback retract.
The next step will be the retraction of the Strongback structure.
Strongback retract has started.
Now we have confirmation that the retraction of the Strongback structure is underway. Clamps at the top of that structure that held on to the top of the second stage are opening up, and you will start to see that structure move away and the gap between the Strongback and the rocket start to expand. This view coming from SpaceX shows those clamp arms open at the top of the Strongback. And here you can see the gap that has opened up between the Strongback structure and the vehicle. Once again, at liftoff, that will swing back further so that the Falcon 9 can cleanly lift off. T-minus 3 minutes and counting. The rocket's autonomous destruct system will be armed shortly.
Stage 1 LOX load is complete.
And there we heard that loading of liquid oxygen on stage 1 is complete. Two and a half minutes to launch. 2 minutes to launch. During the final minute of the countdown, the Falcon 9's flight computers will take control.
Stage 2 LOX load is complete.
And then we hear the call from launch control that the loading of liquid oxygen aboard the second stage is now complete. That means the Falcon 9 is now fully loaded and ready for launch with 1 million pounds of propellant on board.
Closeouts.
There's some venting taking place at the launch pad as the launch pad plumbing and structures that fueled the rocket are purged before liftoff. You see the plumes of gas coming from the vehicle right now in the hot, humid Florida air. Now less than a minute to launch.
Falcon 9 is in startup.
And the confirmation that the Falcon 9's onboard computers are controlling the count.
Hold.
And we've had a hold.
Aborting launch automation. Launch abort is running.
We've not heard the reason for today's hold in the countdown, but this will mean that the launch is scrubbed for today, unfortunately. SpaceX has an instantaneous launch window. The countdown clock stopped at T-minus 40 seconds. The Strongback structure is moving back into position. SpaceX is ending its webcast of this launch. They have not provided any explanation as to the reason for the last-minute hold here. That hold came at T-minus 40 seconds. It's not clear at this point when SpaceX will try again to launch the Falcon 9. It does have another launch opportunity tonight, tomorrow morning. That's at 12:15 a.m. Saturday morning or 4:15 UTC. So everything was proceeding smoothly towards tonight's liftoff. SpaceX had loaded the Falcon 9 with 1 million pounds of propellant, liquid oxygen, and kerosene. The countdown entered its final minute, at which point the onboard computers took control of the countdown. And it was at T-minus 40 seconds that a hold was called. Not clear if the hold was triggered by the onboard computer that is automatically checking all the parameters that are necessary for launch, or if it was a manual intervention that caused tonight's hold. But because of the nature of the densified propellants aboard the vehicle and the launch window requirements of the 54 Starlink satellites, it's not possible for SpaceX to recycle the count and try again tonight. So they scrubbed the launch for tonight. However, we did not get any explanation as to the cause of this hold. The launch team, which is based about 10 miles south of the launch pad at the Launch and Landing Control Center, will be draining the rocket of propellants. So we've not had any additional word from SpaceX as to the cause of tonight's hold and the scrub of the launch. This would have been the 16th flight for this booster, Booster 1060. Joins Booster 1058 at reaching that milestone, or it would have joined Booster 1058 in that milestone. We have also not heard when SpaceX is planning to reschedule the launch. However, they do have another launch opportunity tonight and into tomorrow morning. The T0 would be Saturday at 12:15 a.m. Eastern Time. That's 4:15 UTC. Check spaceflightnow.com for any updates on the launch and our social media channels. And we will be back whenever SpaceX reschedules the launch for full launch coverage. So thank you for joining us tonight. And we look forward to seeing you back here when SpaceX reschedules.